At 57 years old, 3 weeks after she buried her husband she had been quietly planning to leave, Merritt Colshaw sat at her kitchen table with $211 in her checking account, a folded piece of county paper she had found tucked between the pages of his Bible, and the slow, sinking understanding that she had spent 31 years sleeping beside a stranger. The kitchen was small, yellow linoleum peeling up at the corners near the sink. A window above the faucet that looked out on a yard that needed mowing, and a fence that needed paint, and a sky the color of dishwater hanging low over Elkhorn Bend, Arkansas, the way it does in late March when winter won't quite let go and spring hasn't decided to show up yet. She had made coffee out of habit, not thirst. The mug sat in front of her going cold next to a stack of sympathy cards she hadn't opened and a casserole dish from a neighbor she couldn't remember the name of. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for years, of course, but this was a different kind of quiet. The old quiet had been the sound of two people who had run out of things to say to each other. This quiet was the sound of one person realizing she might never have known the right questions to ask. The paper on the table was a warranty deed. She had unfolded it so many times in the past 3 days that the creases had gone soft as cloth. Sawyer County Clerk's Office. Stamped and dated 9 years earlier. 2 acres, parcel 14, Old Ferry Road, on the south bend of the White River, 11 miles from town. Grantee, Waylon James Colshaw. Purchase price, $1,400. Her husband had bought riverfront land 9 years ago and never said a single word about it. Not at supper, not in bed, not on any of the 10,000 ordinary evenings they had spent in this kitchen, sitting across from each other with the television talking low in the next room and nothing passing between them but the salt. 9 years. The same year, she realized with a cold feeling that started in her stomach and spread outward like water soaking through paper that she had first opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and slid a manila folder underneath the winter sweaters she only wore twice a year. Inside that folder, filled out in her own careful handwriting, everything completed but the signature line, were divorce papers. She had carried that folder for 9 years. From the apartment on Garland Street to the rented house on Persimmon Lane to this small place on Dollar Road, they had finally bought outright in 2014. Every time she moved it, she told herself the same thing. Not yet. Not this year. Maybe after the holidays. Maybe after tax season. Maybe after some moment that never seemed to arrive, some final disappointment large enough to justify what she already knew she wanted to do. And now Waylon was dead, and the folder was still unsigned, and here was a deed to land she had never heard of, and she could not decide which secret was worse, his or hers. She picked up the deed and held it to the light from the window, as though the paper itself might tell her something the words on it would not. 2 acres on a bend of the river, 11 miles south. A place he had owned for nearly a decade while she slept beside him, while she cooked his eggs, while she folded his shirts, and put them in the same drawer where she kept the paperwork to end their marriage. What was out there? What had he been doing? She set the deed down and pressed both palms flat on the table and sat very still, the way you sit when you can feel the floor starting to tilt beneath you and you are not yet sure which direction you are going to slide. Let me tell you about Merritt and Waylon, because you cannot understand what she found at the end of that gravel road unless you understand what she believed she had lost long before she got there. They met in the summer of 1992 at a fish fry the volunteer fire department put on every Labor Day weekend at the gravel lot behind the old co-op building on Route 5. Merritt was 25. She was waiting tables 4 shifts a week at a diner on the highway called Patsy's, a place with red vinyl booths and a ceiling fan that wobbled and coffee that tasted like it had been made the day before, which on Mondays it had. She was not unhappy exactly, but she was beginning to feel the particular restlessness of a young woman in a small town who suspects that the life she is living is not the one she was meant for, but cannot quite see the edges of the one she wants. Waylon was 27. He drove for the gravel company, a 12-hour shift hauling crushed limestone from the quarry north of town to job sites in 3 counties. He was tall and quiet and had hands that looked like they had been carved out of the same rock he spent his days moving. He showed up at the fish fry alone, which was unusual because men in Elkhorn Bend did not generally go to social events without a wife or a buddy or at least a dog in the truck to suggest they had somewhere better to be. He didn't say much that night. He didn't say much any night, as Merritt would come to learn, but on that particular evening his silence had a quality to it that she mistook for depth. He watched. He noticed things. She was standing near the drink table with a paper plate of catfish she was too tired to eat, and she realized after about 20 minutes that every time her tea glass got low, it was full again. She hadn't seen him do it. He was just there, quiet and steady, refilling it without being asked, the way a man might tend a fire, not for the attention, but because the fire needed tending. She finally laughed and said, "You planning to drown me?" And Waylon Colshaw went red from his collar to the tops of his ears and said, "No, ma'am. I just noticed it was getting low." That was the whole conversation. That was the entire foundation. She married him 14 months later in a dress borrowed from her sister, in a church with 17 people in the pews and a pastor who mispronounced Waylon's middle name, and she walked out into the September light feeling, for the first and perhaps the last time in her life, that she had chosen well. For a long time, she believed she had. The first 10 years were not exciting, but they were good in the way that a well-built house is good. Solid. Dry. A place you could stand inside and feel the weather pass over without getting wet. Waylon worked long hours and came home tired and sat in the recliner with his boots still on and his eyes half closed, and Merritt would bring him a plate and sit on the arm of the couch and tell him about her day, and he would listen. Or she thought he listened. He would nod, and sometimes he would say, "That right?" or "him," in a way that she took for engagement, the way you take a low hum from an engine as a sign that everything is running the way it should. He was a man who watched. A man who noticed when your glass was low. She had mistaken his silence for still water with something moving underneath. And for those first 10 years, she had been content to sit on the bank and watch the surface and believe that whatever was down there was deep and good and did not need to be named. The cooling did not happen all at once. That was the cruelest part. There was no fight. No betrayal she could point to. No single morning she woke up and felt the temperature drop. It was slower than that, and worse for being slow, because a thing that happens gradually gives you time to adjust to it, and by the time you realize you are cold, you have already been cold so long that you have forgotten what warm felt like. It was 1,000 small evenings where she tried to tell him something, anything, a story from the diner, a thought she'd had driving home, a question about whether he'd ever wanted to travel somewhere, anywhere, and he said, without looking up from the television. It was the way he never started a conversation that was not about the truck or the weather or what was for supper. It was the way he could sit in a room with her for 4 hours and never once seem to register that she was there. She had wanted a partner she could talk to. What she had was a man who would refill her glass for 30 years without ever once asking what she was thirsty for. By her late 40s, she had stopped preaching for him, and he, in his way, had let her. They became two people who shared an address and a grocery list and a bed they lay still in, back to back, with a distance between them that was not measured in inches but in years of accumulated silence. The quiet that had once felt like depth had come to feel like a closed door she had quit knocking on. She did not know yet what was behind that door. That is the part she would never get over. On Sundays, Waylon was gone before she woke up. Fishing, he said, when she used to ask, which she stopped doing around year 4. He would come home at dusk, smelling like river mud and motor oil and something faintly like chalk dust, though she never thought hard about the chalk. He never brought home fish. Not once in 12 years did that man walk through the door with a stringer or a cooler or so much as a story about the one that got away. She had decided, somewhere in her early 50s, that he was having an affair. It was the only explanation that fit. A man does not disappear every Sunday for 12 years and come home with empty hands and quiet eyes and not be doing something he cannot say out loud. She never confronted him. She did not have the energy for the fight, or for the grief that would follow, or for the possibility that he might simply look at her and shrug and confirm what she already believed, that he had found someone worth talking to and it was not her. So she slid the folder a little closer to the front of the drawer and waited for the year she would finally be ready. She was still waiting when he died. Waylon Colshaw passed on a Sunday in March. He was 59 years old. They found him a little after noon, slumped over a small wooden desk in a place Merritt had never seen, his reading glasses still on, an open book under his folded arms. But Merritt did not know about the desk or the book or the glasses for almost a week, because the man who found him, a heavy-set trucker named Grady Phelan, whom Merritt had never met, told the sheriff, and the sheriff told Merritt only that Waylon had passed out by the river, peacefully, fast, the way the lucky ones go. She pictured a fishing pole. She pictured a tackle box and a camp chair and the river running past and the quiet of a Sunday morning in the Ozarks, and she thought, well, at least he died doing the thing he loved, whatever that thing actually was. She did not picture a book, because in 31 years of marriage, she had never once seen Merritt Colshaw read anything but the back of a cereal box, and even that he held at arm's length and set down quick, the way a man handles something hot. The funeral was on a Thursday. Merritt had expected maybe 20 people. The pastor from Elkhorn Bend Baptist, who knew Waylon mostly from Easter services and the occasional chicken supper. A few of his co-workers from the gravel company, men with dust in the creases of their necks who would stand with their hands folded and leave before the reception. Her sister driving up from Conway in a car that burned oil. The neighbor who watered their tomatoes when the August heat got bad. She did not expect the church to fill. She did not expect the parking lot to run out of room, so that men were pulling off along the shoulder of County Road 9 and walking up the gravel in their good boots, some of them in suits that no longer fit, some in clean work shirts pressed hard enough to hold a crease, all of them carrying the particular expression of a man who has come a long way to say goodbye to someone who mattered. There were over 140 people in that church. Merritt counted them later in her mind, going back over the rows the way you replay a scene that does not make sense, trying to find the frame where the picture went wrong. 140 people. She knew maybe 15 of them. She stood at the front in a black dress that pinched at the shoulders, a dress she had bought at the Goodwill in Mountain Home because she did not own one and had not thought she would need one for another 20 years. And she watched a stream of faces she had never seen file past the casket, and every one of them, the old men and the young men, and the men her own age with gray coming in at the temples, every one of them stopped and put a hand flat on the pulse, like they were thanking him. Like they were saying goodbye to a man they had known in a way his own wife had not. A man about 40 came through the line near the end. He had a little girl on his hip, maybe 4 years old, with a ribbon in her hair, and a wife beside him who kept her hand on the small of his back the way you steady someone who might not make it through. When he got to Merritt, he could not speak at first. He just stood there, working his jaw, his eyes wet, the little girl playing with a button on his collar and unaware that anything in the room was breaking. Finally, he said, "Your husband changed my whole life, Mom. I never told my wife how. I'm going to tell her tonight." And then he moved on before Merritt could ask him what he meant. And the next person was already taking her hand, and the moment slid away from her the way the whole day did, fast and underwater and impossible to hold. There were others like him. An old farmer in a suit that pulled across the shoulders and rode up at the wrists, a suit bought in a decade when he was a different shape, who took both of Merritt's hands in his and held them and said only, "He was a fine teacher." "Teacher?" Merritt said, confused, because Waylon had not taught anything. Waylon drove a gravel truck. Waylon barely spoke in sentences longer than 5 words. The old man's face went careful, the way a face goes when it realizes it has said too much. "Of patience, ma'am," he said after a beat. "He taught me patience." And he moved on. A young man, no more than 30, stood at the casket so long the line backed up behind him. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and whispered something Merritt could not hear, and then he straightened up and walked out the side door with his head down and did not come back. And at the very back of the church, standing against the wall where the light from the windows did not quite reach, there was a heavy-set man she did not recognize, a big man in a flannel shirt with his cap crushed in both hands and tears running openly down his face from the first hymn to the last. He did not come through the line. He did not speak to anyone. He stood there the entire service and wept without wiping his face, and he was gone before the final amen slipped out the back door like a man who had said what he came to say without saying a word. She would learn later that his name was Grady Phelan. She would learn that he was the one who had found Waylon. She would learn a great deal more than that, but not yet. Not that day. Merritt stood at the front of that church in her pinching black dress and watched 140 strangers grieve her husband, and she could not have told you the name of a single one of them. And that, more than the casket, more than the flowers wilting in their foam holders, more than the pastor reading from Ecclesiastes in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, that was the thing that frightened her. She had been married to this man for 31 years. She had slept beside him 11,000 nights. And here were 140 people who seemed to know him in a way she never had. Who were they? What did they know? What had she missed? She did not cry at the funeral. She had cried already, alone in the truck in the church parking lot before anyone arrived, with the engine off and the windows fogging and her hands on the steering wheel and a sound coming out of her that she did not recognize as her own voice. What she had cried about was not grief exactly. It was a tangled thing she did not have a name for. Equal parts sorrow and guilt and a strange hollow embarrassment that she was burying a man she had planned to leave, and that she could not, standing there in the fog of her own breath, remember the last real conversation they had ever had. Something about the gutters needing cleaning. Something ordinary. Something she had half listened to with her mind already in the dresser drawer. 31 years. And the last thing she remembered him saying to her was about gutters. It was the following Tuesday, packing his things into boxes for the church donation, that she found the Bible. Waylon kept it on the shelf in the bedroom between a coffee can full of fishing weights and a stack of old gravel haul invoices. Merritt had dusted around that Bible for years without opening it. They were not church people, either of them, except for Easter and the occasional funeral, and she had assumed it was his mother's, kept on the shelf out of habit more than faith, the way you keep a photograph of someone you loved in a frame you never look at, because looking at it would require you to feel something you have decided not to feel. She took it down to put in the donation box. And when she did, the spine fell open in her hands the way a book does when it has been opened to the same page 1,000 times, and a folded paper slid out and landed on the carpet with a sound so small it should not have mattered. She picked it up. It was thin from being handled, soft at the creases. She unfolded it under the bedroom light and read it once, and then again, and then a third time, because the words on it did not fit inside the life she thought she knew. A warranty deed. Stamped by the Sawyer County clerk. Dated 9 years earlier. 2 acres, parcel 14, Old Ferry Road, on the south bend of the White River. Grantee. Waylon James Colshaw. Purchase price, $1,400. Behind the deed, still tucked inside the Bible, was a second piece of paper, and this one stopped her breath. It was a hand-drawn map, Waylon's handwriting, which she would have known anywhere. Big, careful block letters pressed hard into the page, as though every word cost him something. The route from town to the river, 11 miles. Old Ferry Road circled twice. An arrow east along a line he had labeled Gravel Turn. And at the end of it, a small square with the word shack written beside it, and beneath it, 3 words that she would spend the next month trying to understand. Keep it open. Merritt sat down on the edge of the bed with the deed in one hand and the map in the other, and the donation box at her feet half filled with his shirts, and for the first time since the church parking lot, she felt something other than guilt. She felt the floor of her certainty give way. She had been so sure. An affair. A woman somewhere. A coward who could not tell his wife he had checked out of the marriage, or who could not be bothered to come home on the one day a week that was supposed to be theirs. She had built an entire quiet verdict against him, brick by careful brick, over 12 years of Sunday absences, and she had convicted him in a courtroom he never knew existed, and she had sentenced him to the folder in the drawer. And here was a deed she had never seen, in a Bible she had never opened, with a map to a place she had never been, and 3 words in his careful hand that did not sound like a man with something to hide. They sounded like an instruction, like he had known somehow that she would be the one to find them. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed that was too wide now, on her side of the mattress she had not crossed to his in years, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her, the familiar ticks and groans of old wood and bad plumbing, and she thought about 140 strangers putting their hands on a casket, and an old farmer calling her husband a teacher, and a young man with a little girl who said Waylon had changed his whole life. Before dawn, she got up and made coffee in the dark. She put the deed and the map in her purse. She backed the truck out of the driveway and turned south. and she drove 11 miles on roads she had lived beside her whole life and never truly looked at. The drive took her through country that woke up around her as the sky went from black to gray to a thin, cold pink along the ridge. Limestone bluffs rising out of the cedar like the bones of something old and patient. The smell of cedar coming through the cracked window, sharp and clean, the smell of a world that has been cold all night and is just beginning to think about letting go. Old Ferry Road turned to gravel after the second cattle guard, and the gravel was the color of dried blood, red Ozark dust that rose behind the truck and hung in the still air like a curtain closing behind her. She counted 3 mailboxes in 11 miles. 3 families spread across that distance, tucked into hollows and clearings she could not see from the road. The rest was cedar and limestone and silence. She found the gravel turn where Waylon had marked it on the map. A break in the tree line just wide enough for a vehicle, 2 ruts worn deep with use and now beginning to green over down the center strip where nothing had driven in 3 weeks. She followed the ruts through the trees, branches scraping the mirrors, and came out on a flat stretch of ground above the river. And there it was, the shack. It was not much to look at. A single room, maybe 16 by 20 feet, sided in rough cut board that had gone silver gray with weather. A tin roof, rusted at the seams but solid, pitched steep to shed rain toward the water. A stovepipe poking up through it, thin and black against the pink sky. A small porch, just a few planks and 2 posts, and a single window on the riverside with real glass in it, catching the first light of the morning like an eye-opening. There was a padlock on the door. And sitting on the porch step, watching her with its head tilted, was a dog. It was a medium-sized dog, brown and white, with 1 ear that stood up and 1 that flopped over, and it was missing its back left leg. It did not bark. It did not run. It sat there on 3 legs and watched her cut the engine and step out into the cold red dust, and it looked at her with an expression she would later describe to Briggs Tillerman as the saddest thing she had ever seen on a living creature. Not fear, not aggression. Just a quiet, patient disappointment, as though it had been expecting someone and she was not the one it wanted. "Hey," Merritt said softly. The dog thumped its tail once against the plank, once, and went still. She tried the padlock. Locked. She walked the perimeter of the shack through grass that was wet with dew and soaked her shoes, past a stack of firewood split and stacked tight under a blue tarp, past a rain barrel at the corner of the roof, until she came around to the riverside window. She cupped her hands against the glass and looked inside, and she could not make sense of what she saw. There were chairs, not lawn chairs, not the folding aluminum kind a man takes fishing. These were school chairs, the old wooden kind with a writing arm attached, the kind she remembered from grade school, and there were a dozen of them arranged in 2 neat rows facing the front of the room. There was a chalkboard on the far wall, a real one, framed in oak, with words still written on it in blocky capital letters she recognized as Waylon's handwriting. There was a shelf along the side wall, floor to ceiling, packed with books. Dozens of books. Maybe 100. Paperbacks and hardcovers stacked sideways and upright and leaning against each other in the way books do when there are too many of them for the space. There was a small cast iron wood stove with a blue enamel coffee pot sitting on top of it. And there was a desk at the front of the room, a plain wooden desk facing the chairs, and on that desk a book lay open where someone had set it down and never picked it up again. And beside the book, folded neatly, was a pair of reading glasses, Waylon's glasses. The ones she had been told he was wearing when they found him. Merritt stood at that window for a long time. The sun came up over the ridge behind her, and the light moved across the room inside and touched the chalkboard and lit up the words written there, and she could almost read them through the glass, but not quite, and she pressed her forehead against the cold window and closed her eyes. She did not understand what she was looking at, but she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, that it was not what she had believed. There was no other woman in this room. There was no betrayal she could name. There was no evidence of anything she had spent 12 years convicting him of. There was a classroom, hidden in the cedar on a bend of the White River, 11 miles from the house where she had been lying awake at night building a case against him. Her husband had been driving out here every Sunday for 9 years, and she had buried him 3 weeks ago without knowing this place existed. She stood there with her forehead against the glass and her hands on either side of her face and the 3-legged dog watching her from the corner of the porch, and she felt something shift inside her that she would never be able to shift back. Not grief. Not yet. Something worse than grief. The understanding that she had been so certain, so absolutely sure that she knew who he was, that she had never once considered the possibility that she was wrong. She drove back to town with the window cracked and the cold air hitting her face and her hands tight on the wheel, and she went straight to the one place in Elkhorn Bend where a person could learn something the courthouse could not tell you. Tillerman's Feed and Hardware had been on the same corner of Main and Depot since 1961. It was the kind of store that smelled like seed corn and leather and the particular dusty sweetness of dog food sold in bulk from open barrels. The floor was oiled pine worn into shallow valleys where 60 years of boots had walked the same paths between the register and the fence posts and the wall of nails sorted by size into coffee cans with handwritten labels. It was not a place you went for efficiency. It was a place you went when you needed to know something, because the man behind the counter had been standing there long enough to know everything worth knowing about every family within 30 miles, and the things he did not know he had the good sense not to guess at. Briggs Tillerman was in his mid-60s, wide and slow-moving the way certain men get when they have spent a lifetime doing physical work and then traded it for a counter and a cash register and the quiet accumulation of other people's business. He wore reading glasses pushed up into thin white hair and a green apron with Tillerman Feed and Hardware stitched across the chest in thread that was starting to come loose at the T. He looked up when the bell over the door rang. And when he saw Merritt's face, something passed across his own that she could not read. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like the look of a man who has been waiting for a conversation he hoped would never come and has just understood that it is here. "Mrs. Colshaw," he said. He came around the counter. "I'm awful sorry about Waylon. I should have come by sooner. He stopped and looked at his hands and then looked back at her. "I didn't know what to say to you." "Briggs," she said, and something in the way she said his name made him go still. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me straight." She put the deed on the counter between them. "There's a shack out on the river on land Waylon owned and I never knew about. It's full of school desks and a chalkboard. There's a lock on the door I can't open. What was my husband doing out there?" Briggs looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time, longer than a man needs to read a few lines of county language, and Merritt understood that he was not reading it. He was deciding something. Then he reached up and took off his glasses and folded them carefully and set them on the counter the way a man does when he needs both hands free for what he is about to carry. "You ought to sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee. This is a long one, and it's not mine to tell short." He pulled a stool around the end of the counter for her and poured 2 cups from a percolator he kept in the back room, the coffee dark and strong and tasting like it had been sitting since morning, and he set one in front of her and stood across from her with his hands flat on the counter and the deed between them like a document submitted as evidence in a trial neither of them had asked for. Then he told her. "Waylon couldn't read until he was 34 years old, Briggs said. Merritt stared at him. "That's not," she started, and then she stopped. Because in 31 years of marriage, she had never once seen her husband read anything. She had watched him hold a cereal box at arm's length and set it down. She had watched him hand a menu to a waitress and say, "I'll have what she's having," every single time they ate out, which was not often. She had watched him sit in the recliner with the television on and never once pick up a newspaper or a magazine or a book, and she had never let herself wonder why. She had thought he was not interested. She had thought he was incurious. She had thought, and the word sat in her chest now like a stone she had swallowed without knowing it was there, she had thought for 31 years that the man she married was simple. "He hid it from everybody," Briggs went on. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tension in the cords of his neck, that told Merritt this was costing him something to say. "From you, I expect, most of all. That's how it works with men like Waylon. The shame of it. You can't hardly imagine. He left school in the 8th grade. His daddy pulled him out to work the farm, same as his daddy before him, and nobody thought twice about it, because in those days around here, a boy who could drive a tractor was worth more than a boy who could read a textbook." Briggs took a sip of his coffee and set it down. He drove a gravel truck for close to 40 years, and he memorized everything. Road signs by their shape and color. Invoices by where the numbers sat on the page. He'd hand a delivery ticket to the man at the quarry and say, "Read me that back, my eyes are bad." And that man never once knew. He'd have a waitress read the specials to him like he was just being friendly. He'd tell a mechanic to write it up and leave it on the dash, and then he'd bring it home and wait for you to mention what it said. Briggs paused. Waylon got through his whole working life that way, faking it, every single day, terrified that somebody would find out. And the longer he went without telling anybody, the harder it got to tell, because by then, it wasn't just about reading. It was about all the years of lying. 34 years of pretending to be something he wasn't in front of every person he ever met. Merritt sat on the stool with her coffee untouched and her hands in her lap, and a feeling spreading through her that she could not name, a feeling like the walls of the room were still standing, but the floor had quietly dissolved, and she was suspended above something vast and dark that she had walked over her entire marriage without ever looking down. She had thought he was simple. The sentence repeated itself in her head like a heartbeat she could not stop hearing. She had thought he was simple, and she had built her whole understanding of him on that thought, and she had been wrong in a way that was not small or forgivable, but fundamental, the kind of wrong that makes you question not just what you believed, but the instrument you used to believe it. Then, about 25 years ago, Briggs said, the library down in Mountain Home ran an adult literacy program. One evening a week, a retired school teacher named Odette Fenwick ran it. Little woman, must have been near 60 herself by then. Waylon drove 40 minutes each way after a 10-hour shift hauling gravel and never told a soul. Not even me. And I'm the closest thing to a best friend that man ever had. Briggs turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter. He told me once what those first nights were like. Drove 40 minutes in the dark after a day that would have put most men on the couch. Walked into that library shaking, he said, like a man walking into a doctor's office for bad news he already knows is coming. Sat down at a table with a woman old enough to be his mother and a stack of picture books meant for 6-year-olds. He was 34 years old, Merritt. A grown man. Hands like saddle leather. Calluses on his calluses. And Odette Fenwick put a card in front of him with a picture of a cat and the word CAT underneath it and asked him to sound it out. Briggs stopped. He cleared his throat. He said he couldn't get his mouth to work, said his hands were sweating so bad he left wet prints on the table, said he came that close to getting up and walking out and never going back. Briggs held up his finger and thumb a hair's width apart. That close. Because the shame of it, for a man who has spent his entire life making sure nobody ever knows, the shame of sitting there with a picture book while a stranger watches you try to sound out a word your grandchild would know. You cannot hardly imagine what that costs a man like Waylon. But he stayed, Merritt said. Her voice came out in a whisper she did not intend. He stayed. And you know what kept him in that chair? He told me this part more than once, so I know it mattered to him. Odette never once let on it was hard. Never sighed. Never checked the clock. Never looked at him like he was slow, or like he ought to have known this already, or like she had somewhere better to be. She just sat there, that little woman with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, like the two of them had all the time in the world. And every time he got a word right, even a little word, even cat, she'd say, there it is. Real quiet. Real simple. Like he had done something. Briggs shook his head. And he said it had been so long since anybody in his life had told him he'd done something that he would have read the whole library just to hear her say it again. Merritt pressed her fingers against her eyes. She was not crying yet, but she was close, and she did not want to cry in front of Briggs Tillerman because she was afraid that if she started, she would not be able to explain what she was crying about, and what she was crying about was not what Briggs would think. She was not crying because her husband had been illiterate. She was crying because she had lived with him for 31 years, and he had hidden this from her, and the reason he had hidden it was that he was afraid she would think less of him. And she had. She had thought less of him. Not because he could not read, but because she had mistaken his silence for emptiness, his stillness for stupidity, his careful quiet for a man who simply had nothing going on behind his eyes. She had convicted him of being dull, when the truth was he had been drowning in shame every day of his life, and the water was so deep and so still that she had mistaken it for a shallow pond. 2 years, Briggs said. He drove out there for 2 years. Learned to read at 34. And every single thing he built afterward, every rule he wrote on that chalkboard, every bit of it came from how Odette treated him. He wasn't inventing anything. He was passing on exactly what had been handed to him. Briggs looked at Merritt across the counter. And when he could read, you know what he decided? He decided that no grown man in this county was ever going to feel the way he had felt for 34 years. Not if he could help it. So he started teaching. The shack on the river, Briggs told her, had started as nothing more than a location. Waylon had bought the 2 acres because the land was cheap and the road was bad and nobody lived within a mile in any direction. And a man who had spent his entire life hiding a thing understood better than anyone that the men he wanted to help would need a place they could come to without being seen. Not a library in town where someone might recognize their truck. Not a church basement where the pastor's wife might ask questions. A place out on the river where the cedar pressed down to the water and the gravel road was too rough for casual traffic and a man could park his truck behind the tree line and walk in and sit down and not have to worry about his neighbor driving past and wondering what he was doing at a reading class at 47 years old. Shame, Briggs said, was the whole architecture of the problem. A man would rather his wife think he was a drunk or a gambler or a cheat than know he couldn't read a bedtime story to his own child. A man would rather drive 11 miles down a gravel road on his only day off and sit in a one-room shack and learn his letters from a truck driver than walk through the front door of the library in town. That was the depth of it. That was the water these men were living under, and Waylon had lived under it himself, and he knew exactly how deep it went and exactly how cold it was. So he built them a place out where nobody would see. He told the world he was fishing. The men told their wives they were fishing. And on Sunday mornings, 11 miles south of Elkhorn Bend, Waylon Colshaw taught grown men their letters. How many? Merritt asked. Her voice came out cracked and dry, like a voice that has not been used in a long time. Briggs thought about it. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling. I don't rightly know the exact number, but I'd say close to 40 over the years. Maybe more. Truckers mostly, mechanics. A couple of farmers, young fathers who couldn't read to their babies and were torn up about it. He kept a book, wrote down every man's name, and the day that man finished his first whole book on his own, Briggs smiled, and it was a sad smile, the kind that hurts more than it helps. He called it the day the lights come on. That's what he'd say to me the few times he talked about it. I just want to be there the day the lights come on. Like he was an electrician, and these men were houses that had been sitting in the dark, and all he was doing was finding the switch. Merritt put both hands flat on the counter and stared at them. Her own hands. The hands that had packed his shirts into a donation box. The hands that had held a pen over a signature line and not signed. The hands that had lain at her sides in a bed 10 inches from a man she thought she knew and never once reached across. 31 years. Every Sunday for the last 9. River mud and motor oil and chalk dust. Empty hands. She had been filling out a divorce folder while her husband drove 11 miles to turn the lights on in men who had been living in the dark their whole lives. And he had never told her because the thing was built entirely on other men's shame, and a man like Waylon would die before he would spend another man's shame to make himself look good in front of his own wife. Why didn't he tell me? She said. I'm his wife. I was his wife. Why couldn't he tell me one single thing about it? Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the counter, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, a tenderness that did not suit a man his size, but was there all the same. I asked him that, Briggs said. Sat right where you're sitting, maybe 3 years ago. I said, Waylon, she deserves to know. And he got real quiet, the way he did, and then he said something I've thought about every day since. Briggs's voice caught. He cleared it. He said, how do I tell Merritt I've been lying to her about Sundays for 9 years? She'll hear lying. She won't hear why. And then I'll have to tell her the other thing, the thing before that, the 34 years of it, and she'll look at me different. She'll look at me the way I've been afraid of my whole life. And I can't take that from her, Briggs. I'd rather she think I'm a bad husband than know I was a man who couldn't read. Briggs wiped his eye with the heel of his hand, quick, the way men do when they want to pretend they did not. He was scared, Mrs. Colshaw. Same way he was scared his whole life. The same shame that kept him out of the library until he was 34 kept him from telling you what he became after. He knew how it would look. He knew you'd hear 9 years of lying before you heard 25 years of teaching. And he never could find the front door of that conversation. So he just kept the secret one more Sunday. And then one more. And then he ran out of Sundays. Merritt drove home with the deed on the passenger seat and a spare key to the padlock in her coat pocket, because it turned out that half the men in the county had a key to that shack, and she had been the only person in Elkhorn Bend who did not even know there was a lock. She went back the next morning. She parked where she had parked the day before, in the red dust at the end of the ruts, and she got out and stood in front of the door and put the key in the padlock and turned it and heard the click, and she pushed the door open into a room that smelled like wood smoke and old paper, and faintly, underneath everything, like him. That gravel and cedar smell she had known for 31 years, soaked into the boards, into the desks, into the walls. The smell of a man's whole hidden life pressed into wood, the way a handprint presses into wet concrete. The three-legged dog followed her in and lay down beneath the desk at the front of the room with the ease of a creature who has a spot and knows it. And Merritt understood now that he did. This was Parsons' place the same way it was Waylon's, and the dog settled into the familiar hollow he had worn in the floorboards and put his chin on his paws and watched her the way he must have watched Waylon every Sunday for however long he had been coming here. She walked between the rows of school desks. She ran her hand along the writing arms, worn smooth and dark, where dozens of grown men had rested their forearms while they learned to make their letters. She could see it. She could almost feel it in the wood, the weight of those arms, the tension in those hands, the fear and the effort and the slow, grinding patience of a man in his 40s or 50s or 70s, sitting in a child's desk, learning to do what a first grader could do and doing it anyway because somebody had finally made him believe it was worth doing. She looked at the chalkboard. Waylon's writing, his hard block capitals, the last lesson he had never gotten to give. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and below it, a list of words. Thorough, neighbor, rhythm, enough, the hard ones, the ones that break the rules. The ones he would have walked them through one more time, slowly, patiently, the way Odette had walked him through Cat and Dog and Son a quarter century before. And on the desk, the book. Still open to the page he had been reading when his heart stopped. A thin paperback, a child's chapter book about a boy and a horse, the kind of thing you would hand a third grader. There was a slip of paper marking the page, and on the slip, in a shaky hand that was not Waylon's, someone had written, "Waylon, I finished it. The whole thing by myself. Grady Phelan." The trucker. The big man who had stood at the back of the church weeping into his cap. He had been Waylon's student. He had driven out to the river on a Sunday morning to show his teacher the last page of his first finished book, and he had found Waylon already gone, slumped over the desk with the lights still on. Merritt sat down in the desk chair, in Waylon's chair, and she held the book in both hands, and she understood now why Grady Phelan had cried the way he did at the funeral, and why he had stood at the back where no one could reach him, and why he had left before anyone could speak to him. He had come to read his teacher the ending of a story, and the story had ended before he got there. Under the desk, in a drawer that stuck, she found the ledger. It was a hardback composition book, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, soft with handling, the corners worn round. She opened it, and there was Waylon's handwriting, filling page after page, and she sat down in one of the school desks, a desk meant for a grown man learning to read, and she read her husband for the first time in her life. The first page said, "Colshaw's Sunday School. Started April 2015. Below it, in his careful hand, rules. 1. Anybody can come. 2. Nobody gets laughed at. Ever. 3. You don't tell nobody who you saw here. 4. We start at the start, no matter how old you are." Then came the names. Dozens of them, each with 2 dates beside it. The day they came, and the day the lights came on. Grady Phelan. Came January 2016. Lights on November 2018. Note, big man, gentle. Drove 40 minutes same as I used to. Cried the first night. Stayed. Tanner Bowick. Came March 2019. Lights on December 2019. Note, young man, fast learner, wanted to read to his baby girl. Did it. Nolan Pruitt. Came summer 2017, age 71. Lights on spring 2020. Note, oldest yet. Cried when he read the newspaper out loud. Said he'd been pretending 50 years. Emmett Vane. Came fall 2016. Lights on summer 2018. Note. Runs the transmission shop. Memorized every part number by the shape of the box. Read his daughter's wedding invitation out loud in this room. Had to stop twice. Page after page. 41 names. 41 men who had spent their lives faking it, hiding it, memorizing the shapes of words they could not read, and building elaborate architectures of excuses to explain why they never picked up a book. And 41 notes in her husband's careful hand, marking the day each one of them stopped being afraid. The men started coming to see her the way Briggs said they would once word got around town that Waylon's widow had found the shack and was asking questions. They came one at a time in pickup trucks, in the evenings after work, and they stood on the little porch turning their caps in their hands until Merritt came out, and then they told her. Nolan Pruitt came first. 75 now, lean and weathered, with hands like the roots of an old oak. He stood on the porch and looked at the river for a long time before he spoke. "I pretended for 50 years, ma'am," he said. "My wife thought I just didn't care for reading. Truth was I couldn't. Waylon sat with me every Sunday for near 3 years. Never once made me feel like I was stupid. Never once sighed or checked his watch or looked at me like I was wasting his time. The day I read the whole front page of the newspaper out loud to him, he didn't say a word. He just stood up and shook my hand, like I'd done something." Nolan looked out at the river. "I read to my grandbabies now, every night. You know what that's worth to a man who spent 50 years pretending he couldn't? There ain't a number on it." Tanner Bowick came with his little girl, 4 now, riding on his shoulders. He stood on the porch with his voice low so the girl wouldn't hear. "I couldn't read her a bedtime story," he said. "She'd hand me a book, and I'd make up words off the pictures and pray to God she'd fall asleep before she learned enough to catch me. I was 26 years old, and I couldn't read green eggs and ham. I'd have rather died than said that out loud to anyone. Then somebody told me about Waylon. I came out here 9 months. Now." He reached up and patted his daughter's leg. "Now she hands me a book, and I read her the real words. Every word. That's Waylon. That's your husband did that." Emmett Vane came on a Tuesday evening, a lean man in his 50s with engine grease worked permanently into the creases of his hands. He had run the transmission shop on the highway for 30 years. "You know how a man runs a business when he can't read?" he asked Merritt, and he answered his own question. "Real careful. My wife did the books. I told her my eyes were going bad. 30 years I told her that. I had every part number in that shop memorized by the shape of the box because I couldn't read the label. The terror of it, ma'am. Every day, a customer hands you a work order and you've got about 4 seconds to figure out what it says before he starts to wonder why you're staring at it." He looked at his hands. "Waylon taught me for 2 years. First thing I ever read all the way through on my own was my daughter's wedding invitation. She had mailed it to me 6 months before, and I'd been carrying it around in my truck, pretending I'd already read it. I sat in that shack right there, and I read my own girl's wedding invitation out loud, and I had to stop twice because I couldn't see the words through what was happening to my face." Emmett's jaw worked. He swallowed hard. Waylon just waited. Didn't say a word. Just sat there and waited until I could go on. That's the kind of man he was. He knew what it cost because he'd paid the same price himself. There was a woman too. The only one. A widow named Carol Mott, who came not for herself, but to tell Merritt that Waylon had quietly bent his own rules once near the end. "My husband Burl, before he passed, he couldn't read," Carol said. She was a small woman in her 70s with silver hair and a voice that was steady the way a voice gets when it has already done all the breaking it is going to do. And he was dying, and it ate at him that he had never read the Bible his mother gave him. Couldn't get up to drive to the river anymore. So Waylon came to us. Drove out to our place every Sunday evening for the last 4 months of Burl's life and sat at our kitchen table and helped him read it. A little at a time. A few verses. Then a few more. Burl made it to the Psalms before he passed. Carol pressed an envelope into Merritt's hand. Burl wrote him a thank you note. Took Burl a week to write it. Waylon kept it. I found it in that ledger drawer, and I think you ought to have it." Inside the envelope, in a dying man's labored handwriting, were 6 words, misspelled and perfect. "Thank you for the words, Burl." Grady Phelan came last, the big trucker who had found Waylon. He could not talk at first. He sat on the porch step next to Parson and scratched the dog's good ear for a long while, and neither of them spoke, and the river moved past in the gray light, and the cedar smell came up off the water. "Waylon named that dog," Grady finally said. "Showed up out here half-starved a couple years back, missing the leg from a coyote trap. Waylon fed him, cleaned him up. I asked what we ought to call him, and Waylon looked at him for a second and said, 'Parson,' because he shows up every Sunday and don't say a word, and somehow you still feel better he's there." Grady laughed, wet-eyed. That was Waylon all over. Quietest man I ever knew, and somehow the most words I ever learned came out of his classroom. Grady looked at Merritt. "I'm sorry I'm the one who found him, ma'am. I'm sorry that's how you had to hear about it. But I'll tell you something." His glasses were on, and his book was open, and there was a little smile on his face. He died in the one place on this earth where he wasn't pretending to be anything but exactly what he was. There are worse ways to go. There ain't many better. Merritt carried all of it back to the shack the next morning. All of their stories, all of their faces, all of the pieces of her husband she had never been given. She sat at the desk and opened the ledger again and turned past the 41 names to the pages near the back, the pages she had not read yet because the light had been failing the day before, and because some part of her had known that whatever was on those pages was going to finish what the rest of it had started. She was right. Scattered through the back of the ledger, between lesson plans and word lists and notes about which sounds gave which men the most trouble, were sentences that were not about the students at all. They were practice. Waylon had been practicing his own writing the way he had taught the others to practice theirs. And what he had been practicing over and over, crossed out and started again, was a letter. To her. "Merritt, there is a thing I have been meaning to tell you for 9 years, and I don't know how." Crossed out. Then again on the next line, smaller, as though he were trying to make himself quieter on the page, the way he was quiet everywhere else. "Merritt, I know you think I don't." Another page. Another attempt. "Dear Merritt, I am not a smart man, but I am trying to learn how to say," and it stopped. Crossed out with a single hard line. The last one, written in handwriting that was steadier than the others, as though he had been getting closer, as though 25 years of practice had finally brought him within reach of the words he wanted, was dated only a few weeks before he died. "Merritt, by the time I get the nerve to give you this, I want it to be wrote good enough that you will see I meant every word. So I am practicing. A man taught me you can learn anything at any age if you are not too proud to start at the start. I should have told you this years ago. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I—" And there the last entry ended, mid-sentence, because Waylon Colshaw had run out of Sundays. Merritt sat in the wooden desk with the ledger in her lap and the 3-legged dog warm against her ankle and the river running gray and steady past the window, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry at the funeral. Not the controlled, private crying she had done in the truck in the parking lot. This was the other kind. The kind that comes up from a place you did not know you had, from somewhere below the floor of the self you have built, the crying that sounds like it belongs to someone else because you have never heard yourself make that sound before. She cried for a man she had decided to leave because she thought he had nothing to say to her, when the truth was he had been teaching himself, at 59 years old, how to write her a love letter good enough to deserve her. She had been so sure she knew him. That was the thing that hollowed her out, standing in that room with the chalk dust and the river light and the dog and the book and the glasses and the 41 names. Not that he was gone. That she had had him for 31 years and never once looked past her own certainty long enough to see him. She had thought the door was empty. She had stopped knocking years ago. The whole time he had been on the other side of it, trying to learn the words to let her in. She had made up her mind. Whatever those 3 words on the map had meant, whatever instruction Waylon had folded into the pages of a Bible she had never opened, she was going to honor it. She would reopen the Sunday school. She would learn how it was done. She would keep the ledger going and write her own name beneath his and let the men keep coming the way they had come to Waylon, one at a time, in the early morning, when the world was still quiet enough that a man could admit out loud the thing he had spent his whole life hiding. That was the plan she fell asleep with, 3 weeks a widow, for the first time at peace with the man she had buried and at war with the woman she had been while he was alive. And that was when Dalton Colshaw drove up the gravel turn in a white Tahoe with dealer plates and a real estate sign stuck to the door with a magnet that was already peeling at one corner. Merritt heard the engine before she saw the vehicle. She was standing on the porch of the shack with a mug of coffee and Parson beside her, the dog's ears both pitched forward, the one that stood and the one that flopped, both aimed at the sound coming up through the trees. A heavy engine. Something with weight to it. Moving too fast for that road, throwing gravel against the undercarriage in a way that told her whoever was driving had not been down this road often enough to know it would cost him a paint job. The Tahoe came out of the cedars and pulled into the clearing and stopped. And a man got out smiling, and the smile was the first thing Merritt noticed because it arrived before the rest of him, the way a salesman's smile always does, out front, leading, doing the work before the mouth behind it has to say anything at all. Dalton Colshaw was about 40. Waylon's nephew, his late brother's only boy. Merritt had met him exactly twice in 31 years, both times at funerals, which she would later think was fitting, because Dalton had a way of showing up only when something had died and there was something left to pick over. He was soft-handed, in a quarter-zip pullover the color of oatmeal, and pressed jeans and boots that had never seen a day of mud or gravel or honest work. He stood beside the Tahoe and looked at the shack the way you look at something you are already measuring for the dumpster. "Aunt Merritt," he said, though she had never been his aunt in any way that counted. "I heard you'd been coming out here. I've been meaning to talk to you about all this." He gestured at the 2 acres, the river, the shack, the porch where she stood, with a small wave of his hand that took it all in and dismissed it at the same time, the way a man waves at a cloud of gnats. "I'll be honest with you," he said, "because I think you've got enough on your plate. This property is a problem you don't need." "It's not a problem," Merritt said. "It's mine." "Well." Dalton's smile did not move. It stayed exactly where it was, fixed to his face like a decal on a window. "That's actually the thing I wanted to talk to you about." He leaned against the Tahoe and crossed his arms, and he told her a story. A story about a handshake deal with Uncle Waylon years ago. A story about Waylon wanting the land to stay in the family with someone who could do something with it, someone who understood property and development and the way the world was moving. Dalton was in real estate. Waylon had known that. There had been an understanding between them. Merritt listened and did not speak, and the silence she gave him was not the kind she had given Waylon for 31 years, the silence of giving up. It was the silence of a woman listening to a man build a house of cards and waiting to see how high he would stack it before she breathed. "Here's where it gets time-sensitive," Dalton went on, and now the salesman in him took over entirely, and the words came faster. And there was a shine on him that Merritt recognized from men who sold things for a living, the shine of a man who has rehearsed his pitch in the mirror and believes in it the way an actor believes in a monologue. "There's a development group out of Branson, Hollow Bend Marina. They're putting in a 140-slip marina and a resort about a mile downriver. Restaurant, boat launch, the whole thing. It's going to change this end of the county." He paused the way a man pauses when he wants the next sentence to land with weight. "The engineers say the only access route that works for the construction runs right through here, right through this piece of land." He nodded at the shack behind her. "I've been working with the marina people. They're prepared to offer a position and a finder's interest if I can deliver this parcel clean. And what that means for you, Aunt Merritt, is that if you let me handle this, there's real money in it. 40, maybe $50,000 for a piece of riverbank with a falling-down fishing shack on it." He spread his hands, palms up, a picture of reason. "That's a life-changing number for a woman in your situation." "My situation," Merritt said. "You're 57. I checked, and Waylon didn't leave much. I'm not trying to be harsh, I'm trying to help. Nobody's going to remember this old chicken coop in 5 years, but $50,000 changes your whole retirement." He reached into the Tahoe and pulled out a manila folder and held it out to her. "I've got a buy-sell already drawn up. You sign over the property, I handle the marina deal, everybody wins. Clean and simple." Merritt did not take the folder. She looked at Dalton, and then she looked past him at the shack. At the chalkboard she could see through the window, the quick brown fox still written in Waylon's hand. at the rows of desks where 41 men had learned their letters. At Parson standing now in the doorway with his hackles raised, a low sound coming out of the dog's chest that she had never heard before, a sound that was not quite a growl, but was the warning that comes before one. "Do you know what this is?" she asked quietly. "It's a fishing shack." "Do you know what my husband did out here?" Dalton sighed, the small impatient sigh of a man who has a number and a timeline and does not have room in either for sentiment. "Aunt Merritt, I really don't have time for—" "He taught 41 grown men to read," she said. "Men who'd been hiding it their whole lives. He did it for free, on his day off, for 9 years, and he never told a single person who didn't need to know, including me." She let the words sit in the cold air between them. "That chalkboard is the last lesson he ever wrote. That book on the desk is what he was reading when his heart stopped. And you want to bulldoze it for an access road and call it a chicken coop." Something moved across Dalton's face. A flicker, quick as a fish turning in shallow water, of understanding that he had misjudged the ground he was standing on. That this was not a tired widow with an empty bank account and a piece of scrubland she would be grateful to unload. That this was something else, something he had not calculated for, and the math he had done in the Tahoe on the way out here was wrong. And then he papered over it. The smile came back, thinner now, tighter at the corners. "That's a real nice story," he said. "And I mean that, but a story doesn't pay property taxes and it doesn't stop a marina. Look." He put the folder on the hood of the Tahoe and crossed his arms. "I didn't want to get into this part, but I'll be straight with you. I'm not sure Waylon's estate is as clean as you think. He died sudden. No warning. Did he leave a will? Because if he died without one, this property goes through probate, and as blood family, I've got standing. And what you've got is a lawyer's bill you can't afford." He let that land. "Or," he said, "we do this the easy way. You walk away with $50,000 and my gratitude, and this whole thing is done by the end of the month. Your choice. Think about it." He got in the Tahoe and backed it around in the red dust and drove off up the gravel turn, and Parsons stood in the doorway of the shack and growled until the sound of the engine faded out down the road, and the only thing left was the river and the cedars and the quiet. Merritt stood very still for a long time after he was gone. Her hands were shaking. She looked down at them and hated that they were shaking, because she could feel Dalton's words doing exactly what he had designed them to do, finding the soft places, the cracks in her resolve, the spots where 31 years of going along had worn the stone thin enough to break. A widow. Not much money. A lawyer she could not afford. Maybe he was right that there was no will. Maybe blood beat a spouse in probate court. Maybe she would fight and lose and end up with nothing. Not even the 50,000, not even the shack, not even the right to stand on this porch and feel what she was feeling. She stood there and felt the old habit rise up in her. The habit of a lifetime. The habit of going quiet, of not making the fight, of folding instead of calling, of sliding the folder closer to the front of the drawer and telling herself, not yet, not this year, maybe after. The habit of a woman who had spent 57 years accommodating the world instead of asking the world to accommodate her. She picked up her phone. She found Dalton's number in the call log from the voicemail he had left her 2 days ago, the one that said he wanted to come out and discuss the property situation, words she had not understood at the time, but understood at the time, but understood now. She held the phone in her hand and looked at the screen, and her thumb hovered over the call button. $50,000. Enough to pay off the house. Enough to stop lying awake at night doing arithmetic against the ceiling. Enough to make the next 10 years look like something other than a slow slide toward a kind of poverty she had smelled on other women in this town and swore she would never wear. She could call him. She could say yes. She could sign the paper and take the money and let the marina people do whatever they wanted with 2 acres of cedar and river rock and a one-room shack full of school desks. Nobody would blame her. Nobody would even know, because the men who had sat in those desks had spent their whole lives making sure nobody knew about any of it. Her thumb touched the edge of the screen. And then she looked through the window of the shack, and she saw the ledger sitting on the desk where she had left it, and she thought about a man who drove 40 minutes after a 10-hour shift to sit in a child's chair and sound out the word cat at 34 years old, and who was so close to walking out that first night that the distance between staying and leaving was the width of a fingernail. and she thought about what he had written in the back of that ledger, in his hard-won handwriting, in the letter he never finished. A man taught me you can learn anything at any age if you are not too proud to start at the start. She put the phone in her pocket. She was 57 years old. She had never fought for anything in her life. She had never raised her voice in a room full of strangers, or hired a lawyer, or stood across from anyone and said the word no with enough weight behind it to make it stick. She had spent 3 decades going along, and the going along had cost her the only man she had ever loved, not because he left, but because she stopped looking, and not because he was gone, but because she decided she already knew what was there. She was not going to go along anymore. She was not too proud to start. She started at the feed store. Briggs Tillerman listened to the whole thing, his jaw going tight, the way a man's jaw goes when he is hearing something he expected and hates being right about. When Merritt finished, he said one word. "Dalton." He said it the way you say the name of something that tastes bad. That boy's been a buzzard since he could walk. Showed up at his own daddy's funeral asking about the truck title. Then Briggs looked at Merritt, and the tightness in his jaw eased into something else, something that might have been relief or satisfaction, or the look a man gets when he sees someone finally decide to do the thing he has been hoping they would do. "Waylon had a will, Merritt. I know it for a fact, because I'm one of the 2 people who witnessed it. It took 2 days to find it. It was not in a lawyer's office, because Waylon had never paid a lawyer for anything in his life. It was not in a safe deposit box, because Waylon did not trust banks any further than he could see them from the truck window. It was where Merritt should have known to look first and did not, because even now, even after everything she had learned in the past 2 weeks, she was still not fully accustomed to thinking of her husband as a man who put important things in writing. It was in the Bible, folded into the back cover, behind the maps of the Holy Land, behind a page in Psalms that Waylon had underlined slowly and carefully with a pencil, was a single sheet of paper covered in his block capitals. "I, Waylon James Colshaw, being of sound mind, leave everything I own, including the 2 acres and building on Old Ferry Road, to my wife Merritt. I want the school kept open as long as she is able." Below it, 3 signatures. Waylon's, Briggs Tillerman's, and Odette Fenwick's, the schoolteacher who had taught Waylon to read, who was 83 years old and very much alive and living in a small tidy house in Mountain Home with a yard full of bird feeders and a mailbox she could read and a memory that went back far enough to remember a 34-year-old truck driver who walked into her classroom shaking. Waylon had had the will notarized at the First National Bank of Elkhorn Bend the same week he wrote it, 2 years before he died. The notarized copy was on file at the county courthouse, where it had been sitting in a clerk's drawer while Dalton Colshaw drove around in a white Tahoe, telling a widow she had no legal standing on her own husband's land. Merritt sat with that will in her hands in the kitchen on Dollar Road, and the relief that went through her was so complete it left her dizzy and slightly sick, the way you feel when you have been holding your breath for so long that the first gulp of air hurts more than the suffocating did. He had protected her. 2 years ago, while she was repositioning a folder in a dresser drawer and rehearsing the speech she would give him when she finally found the courage to leave, Waylon had been driving to the bank to make sure that whatever happened to him, the land and the school and the future of both would go to her and to nobody else. Keep it open. The note on the map had not been an instruction left for a stranger. It had been an instruction left for her. He had known she would be the one to find it. He had been counting on it. He had trusted her with the one thing that mattered to him most, even though she had spent the last 9 years planning to walk away from everything else. She could have stopped there. The will was airtight. Dalton had no standing, and once he learned about the notarized copy on file at the courthouse, he would fold his hand and disappear the way men like him always disappeared when the bluff was called. She could have let it die quietly, the way Waylon had done everything quietly. But the marina people had filed a petition with the county to rezone the parcel and condemn an access easement through the property for the public good. There was a hearing before the Planning Commission on the last Thursday of the month, and Merritt decided that the men of Colshaw's Sunday school were not going to let their teacher's classroom be bulldozed without their voices in the room. She went to see them. Nolan and Tanner and Grady and Emmett and the others, the truckers and the farmers and the young fathers. She told them what Dalton wanted to do, and she told them about the will, and then she asked them for the thing she knew was the hardest thing in the world for men like them to give. She asked them to come to a public meeting in front of the whole county and admit, out loud, with their names attached, that there had been a time in their lives when they could not read. There was a long silence in the feed store where she had gathered the dozen or so who could make it. These were men who had hidden this thing for decades, who had memorized part numbers by the shape of the box and road signs by their color and menus by their position on the page, who had told their wives their eyes were bad, their wives who did the bills and read the mail and never questioned it, who had built entire lives on the foundation of a single secret, and who understood that what Merritt was asking them to do was take a sledgehammer to that foundation in a room full of people they would have to face at the grocery store for the rest of their lives. She watched them look at the floor, at their boots, at the coffee in their cups, at each other with the quick glances of men who are checking to see if anyone else is going to be the first one to jump. It was Nolan Pruitt who stood up, 75 years old, lean as a fence post and just as hard. He put his coffee cup on the counter and stood up straight and looked around the room at the men he had sat beside in a one-room shack on the river every Sunday morning for years. "I pretended for 50 years, he said. "I'm done pretending. If standing up in front of the county and saying I couldn't read until I was 71 is what it takes to save the place that fixed it, then I'll stand up. Waylon never let me feel small in that room. I will be damned if I let some boy in a Tahoe call it a chicken coop." One by one, around the room, the rest of them stood. The night before the meeting, Merritt drove the 40 minutes to Mountain Home to see Odette Fenwick. She went because she was afraid, and because she did not know what to do with the fear, and because the one person left alive who had known Waylon the longest was an 83-year-old woman in a house that smelled like chamomile tea and birdseed. Odette was small and precise, the kind of woman who had been old for so long that she had gotten comfortable with it the way you get comfortable with a chair that fits you. She made tea and listened to the whole story without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her eyes steady behind reading glasses on a silver chain. And when Merritt finished, she set down her cup. "You're scared you'll get up there and freeze," Odette said. It was not a question. "I've never spoken in front of people in my life," Merritt said. "I've never fought anybody for anything. Waylon was the quiet one. Everybody says that, but I was the one who went along. 31 years I went along." Odette nodded slowly. "Let me tell you something about your husband that you might not know even now," she said. "When Waylon could finally read, after 2 years, he didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or tell his friends or even smile very much about it. You know what he did? He came to me and he sat right where you're sitting and he said, 'Miss Odette, I'm ashamed of all the years I let go by, all the years I wasted hiding.' And I told him the same thing I am going to tell you right now." She reached across the table and tapped the back of Merritt's hand with one dry, paper-like finger. "Shame for the wasted years is just pride wearing a black coat. It looks like humility, but it's not. It's still about you. It's still a way of standing in front of the mirror, feeling sorry for the person looking back. The only thing worth doing with the time you've got left is to use it." Waylon didn't waste another Sunday feeling bad about the 34 years. He spent the next 25 turning lights on. She tapped Merritt's hand again. "You spent 31 years going along. Fine. You can spend the rest of them going along, or you can stand up tomorrow night in that ugly little government room and turn a light on. But you don't get to do both. And you don't get to spend the time you've got left being sorry about the time you didn't." Merritt drove home in the dark with the heater rattling and the headlights cutting through fog that had come up off the river and spread across the road like gauze. And somewhere around the second cattle guard, she stopped being afraid. Or rather, she stopped letting the fear make the decision. The fear was still there. It was sitting in the passenger seat the way it had been sitting there her whole life, buckled in and comfortable and ready to reach over and take the wheel the moment she loosened her grip. But she was not going to let it drive. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not anymore. She was still afraid. She was just done going along. The Planning Commission meeting was held in the basement of the Sawyer County Courthouse, in a room with fluorescent lights that buzzed and metal folding chairs and a long laminate table where 5 commissioners sat with name placards in front of them and water glasses they never drank from. The room smelled like floor wax and old coffee and the particular staleness of a government building that has been closed up for the weekend and not yet aired out. The Hollow Bend Marina people had come up from Branson with a lawyer in a grey suit and a glossy site plan mounted on an easel at the front of the room. The site plan showed little rendered sailboats on blue water and a sunset that existed nowhere in nature, orange and purple and gold, hovering over a resort complex that did not exist yet and might never exist, but that looked on the easel like the future of Sawyer County rendered in watercolor and ambition. Dalton sat in the front row in his quarter-zip, legs crossed, looking pleased. He had the look of a man who has already counted the money and is now simply waiting for the formality to conclude. The room filled up. Word had gotten around. By the time the chairman called the meeting to order, there were people standing along the back wall and leaning against the doorframe and sitting on the windowsills because there were not enough chairs, and the fluorescent lights hummed over all of them like the sound of something electrical getting ready to happen. The marina lawyer went first. He was smooth and practiced, and he talked about jobs and tax revenue and 140 boat slips and the economic future of a county that had been losing young people for 30 years. He talked about infrastructure and investment and the kind of growth that lifts all boats, and he did not seem to notice or did not care about the irony of using that particular phrase. He talked about a single recalcitrant parcel standing in the way of progress, an abandoned outbuilding of no historical or economic value, and the routine condemnation of an access easement for the greater public good. He was good at his job. When he sat down, the commissioners were nodding. Then the chairman asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition, and you could see on his face that he expected no one, that he expected the pause to be brief and procedural, and that they would move to a vote and be done in time for the late news. Nolan Pruitt stood up. He walked to the podium with the microphone, an old man in a pressed white shirt buttoned to the collar, moving slowly but straight, the way a man moves when he has decided where he is going and is not in a hurry to get there because he knows that what he has to say will keep. He took a folded piece of newspaper from his shirt pocket and smoothed it out on the podium with his root-knuckled hands, and the sound of the paper unfolding was the only sound in the room. "My name is Nolan Pruitt," he said. "I'm 75 years old, and I've farmed in this county my whole life. And 4 years ago, I could not have read you a single word of this." He held up the newspaper. "Not a word. I faked it for 50 years. My own wife didn't know." A murmur went through the room. The kind of murmur that is not words, but the sound of 100 people recalibrating what they thought they knew. There was a man named Merritt Colshaw who built a school out on the river and taught me to read when I was 71 years old, for free, on his day off. And he never told anyone, because he understood the shame of it the same way I did, because he'd carried it himself. Nolan bent his head to the newspaper and read aloud, slowly, carefully, each word landing in the silent room with the weight of a thing that has traveled a very long distance to arrive. It was a short article about a high school baseball game, box scores and batting averages, and the name of a kid who had hit a double in the 7th inning. It was nothing. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. And when Nolan finished and looked up, half the room had a hand over their mouth because they understood what they had just watched. They had just watched a 75-year-old man do in public the thing he had spent 50 years hiding. He sat down, and Tanner Bowick stood up. Tanner read a page from a children's chapter book, the one about the boy and the horse, his daughter on his hip, and at the end he said, "I read this to her every night now. That building is where I learned how. That's what you want to bulldoze." He sat down. And Grady Phelan stood up, the big trucker, and he did not read anything. He just stood at the podium and gripped the sides of it with his hands and said, in a voice that was steady and enormous and filled the room the way a man his size fills a doorway, "I found Merritt Colshaw the day he died. He was sitting at his desk in that classroom with his glasses on and a book open in front of him. He died teaching men like me. Men everybody else gave up on. You want to run a road through the place where that happened. I want every person in this room to understand what you'd be running it through." He sat down, and Emmett Vane stood up, and another man after him, and another. 11 men, one after another, stood up in the basement of the Sawyer County Courthouse under the fluorescent lights and confessed in front of their neighbors the thing they had hidden their entire lives. And then they read something out loud to prove what had been given to them in a one-room shack on a bend of the White River by a man who had known exactly what it cost because he had paid the price himself. It was the loudest argument Merritt had ever heard, and not a single one of them raised his voice. By the time the 11th man sat down, the marina lawyer had stopped looking at his site plan. The commissioners were no longer nodding, and Dalton Colshaw, in the front row, had gone the color of old ash because he had walked into this room with a chicken coop and was now sitting in a room that had just turned that chicken coop into the most important building in the county. Then Merritt stood up. She walked to the podium and she set down two things: the notarized will, leaving the land and the school to her with one instruction, and the ledger, 41 names, each with the day the lights came on. "My husband owned that land free and clear," she said, "and he left it to me in writing, witnessed and notarized and on file in this building with one instruction: keep it open. I intend to honor that instruction for as long as I am able." She looked at the marina lawyer. Then she looked at Dalton, and she did not look away. There is no handshake deal. There is no clean parcel to deliver. There is a will, and there is a widow, and there are 41 men in this county who can read because of what happened in that building. You can route your road around it the same way you would route it around a church, because that is what it is. She picked up the ledger and held it against her chest. "Thank you." The Planning Commission voted 4-1 to deny the easement and to recommend the parcel for a county historical designation. The marina would be built. It would just not be built through Colshaw's Sunday school. Dalton left before the vote was finished. Merritt never heard from him again except for a single voicemail left a week later, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it, saying only, "I didn't know what it was. I want you to know that. I didn't know." She did not call him back. But she did not delete the message either. She listened to it twice, sitting on the porch of the shack with Parson beside her and the river going silver in the evening light, and she thought about a man who had been a buzzard his whole life and who had, somewhere at the bottom of himself, enough shame left to leave those words on a stranger's voicemail. She knew something about shame now. She knew how it could lock a person inside themselves for decades. She knew how it could make a man hide the best thing about himself from the woman who slept beside him. She was not going to be sure of people anymore. She had been wrong about that her whole marriage. Being sure was the thing that had cost her everything. Odette Fenwick came to the shack that spring, 83 years old, brought by Briggs in his truck because she no longer drove. She walked between the rows of desks slowly, with a cane, running her free hand along the writing arms the way Merritt had done, and she stopped at the chalkboard and read "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," and laughed, a dry, warm sound, the laugh of a woman who has seen her own small kindness come back to her multiplied beyond anything she could have imagined. "I taught him that sentence," she said. "Every letter of the alphabet in one line. He must have used it with all of them." She turned to Merritt. "Your husband was the best student I ever had. You know why? Not because he was the smartest, because he was the least proud. A proud man cannot learn. He is too busy protecting what he doesn't know." Waylon walked into my classroom at 34 years old and sat down in a child's chair and said, "Ma'am, I can't read. Will you teach me?" And there wasn't a speck of pride in him to get in the way. Odette put her old hand on Merritt's arm. "You keep this open, you hear me? There are still men in this county sitting in the dark. They'll come if there's a light on." Merritt kept it open. She talked to Odette about methods and patience, and the particular art of teaching a grown man something a child is expected to know without making him feel like a child for not knowing it. She talked to Grady and Nolan and Tanner, the ones who had been taught and could now help teach, and by summer Colshaw's Sunday school was running again, Sunday mornings, 11 miles south of town, with the wood stove going in the cool months and the river window open in the warm ones, and Parson the three-legged dog asleep under the desk where he had always slept. She learned to teach. She was not a natural the way Waylon had been. She was impatient at first, and she had to learn the patience the way he must have learned it, one frustrated Sunday at a time, by doing it badly, and then doing it less badly, and then, slowly, doing it in a way that did not require her to think about it because it had become part of her the way breathing is part of you. She learned that you never finished a man's sentence for him, no matter how long he hung on a word, because the whole point was that he got there himself. She learned to keep her face still and her voice low, and to say, when a man finally broke a hard word into its pieces and put it back together right, only 2 words. There it is. The way Odette had said it to Waylon. The way Waylon had said it to 41 men. The smallest words in the language, and somehow the heaviest. She learned which men needed her to sit close, shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of another person beside them while they worked, and which men needed her to sit across the room and pretend to read her own book so they did not feel watched. She learned that the river window, which she had always assumed was for the view, was there so that a man could look out at the water for a moment when his eyes got wet and not have to explain why. The first time she sat beside a 48-year-old roofer named Dell and watched him read his way through a whole short book on his own, sounding out the hard words with his finger under the line, his lips moving, his brow creased with an effort that had nothing to do with the muscles of his face and everything to do with the door inside him that was swinging open for the first time in his life, she understood. Finally and completely, she understood what her husband had driven 11 miles every Sunday for 9 years to feel. Dell got to the last page and closed the book and sat there for a moment with his hands on the cover and his eyes on the desk. And then he looked up at Merritt, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be bigger than what had just happened in that small wooden room. There it is. She found the folder that summer when she finally cleaned out the dresser on Dollar Road. The divorce papers. 9 years old, soft at the creases from being moved from one hiding place to another. Everything filled out but the signature line. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them for a long time, the way she had looked at the deed the day she found it, turning them over in her hands as though they were a letter from someone she used to be. Then she took them out to the shack and opened the door of the wood stove and fed them in, page by page, and watched them curl and blacken and dissolve into ash and heat and nothing. She did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel guilty. She felt the way you feel when you finally set down something you have been carrying so long that you forgot it was heavy. She had been so sure she knew him. She had almost left him over a silence that turned out to be the most extraordinary thing about him. She would carry that, the almost, for the rest of her life. But she would carry it the way you carry a scar, not a wound. Proof that you had been somewhere and come through changed. In the front of the ledger, Waylon had written Colshaw's Sunday School started April 2015. And on the last page he had ever written, the practice letter trailed off mid-sentence, the pen stopped where the heart stopped. Every Sunday I drove out here I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what and then silence forever in his careful hard-won hand. Merritt took a pen on a Sunday evening in the fall, after the last man had driven off down the gravel turn and the river had gone gold and then grey in the window. She turned to a fresh page near the back of the ledger, after his 41 names, after his unfinished letter. She thought about what to write for a long time. She listened to the river and the cedar and the dog breathing under the desk and the particular quality of quiet that fills a room where something important has been learned and not yet forgotten. And then she wrote her own line under his. Merritt Colshaw. Kept it open. Started teaching April 2025. And below that, because she was answering the sentence he never got to finish, the only way left to answer it, she wrote 6 words. I know what you were going to tell me, Waylon. I found it in every name in this book. I should have looked sooner. I'm looking now. She closed the ledger and set it on the desk beside his glasses, which she had never moved and never would. Parsons stirred under the desk and rested his chin on her foot. Outside, the river ran on toward the marina they had built a mile downstream, 140 slips and a restaurant with a deck, and the cedar smell came through the open window, sharp and clean, the smell she had spent 31 years thinking was just the place where her husband disappeared to, and now knew was the smell of the one place on earth where Waylon Colshaw had never pretended to be anything but exactly what he was. She had buried a man she thought she knew. She had $211 and a will and a school and a 3-legged dog and 41 men who had stood up in front of the county to defend their teacher's name and a ledger full of names and dates and the careful handwriting of a man who learned to read at 34 and spent the rest of his life making sure no one else had to wait that long. She had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered. And she had been given, by a folded deed in a Bible she never opened, the rarest thing a person ever receives. A second chance to know someone she had already lost. Merritt turned off the lamp on the desk. She locked the door of the shack with the key Briggs had given her, the same key half the men in the county carried in their pockets, and she stood on the small porch in the cool dark with Parson beside her and looked out at the river moving past in the last light. The classroom was dark now, but the lights would come on again Sunday. They always would, as long as she was able. She was 57 years old, and she was not too proud to start. She drove home in the dark, 11 miles north, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence in the truck did not feel like something missing. It felt like something kept.